toil and trouble, fire burning, cauldron bubble, fill it up, fanny snake, in the cauldron, boiling bay.
Greetings. In the protocols of the medieval Inquisition, we find astonishing confessions from condemned witches and sorceresses about their communication with Satan. These sessions typically took place weekly in some secluded location, often at an abandoned cemetery, around a gallows, or amidst the ruins of a castle or monastery. To get there, the witches used a rather simple means. The devils gave the sorceress a special ointment made from the liver of unbaptized children who had died. The sorceress only needed to rub this ointment on her body, recite magical words, and mount a broomstick to instantly fly through the air. Then, upon arriving at the Sabbath, it was necessary to worship Satan as the leader of the gathering. He sat on a throne in the form of a giant goat with a massive tail and wings like those of a bat. However, sometimes he took on a different form, as the testimonies of the witches could vary. The greeting ritual involved the witch kissing Satan in a spot beneath his tail. Afterward, the witches and sorcerers would form a circle and dance, facing away from each other. At exactly midnight, everyone would fall prostrate before their master. This was the moment of supreme worship. After this, a feast would begin. Large quantities of frogs, corpses, and the livers and hearts of unbaptized children were especially consumed. An essential element of the Sabbath was the Black Mass and the mass copulation of the participants. The main sexual partner was, of course, Satan, from whom the women claimed to receive immense sexual pleasure. Many noted the exceptionally large genitalia of the Prince of Darkness. In other confessions, sorcerers described a multitude of unclean spirits who, taking on the form of dwarfs, would emerge from the walls. Besides Satan himself, the women's sexual partners could include incubi, or demons, while in the men's accounts, these were succubi, female devils. You might say that these testimonies, extracted from unfortunate women under torture, are worthless. However, a significant portion of these confessions was obtained without any torture and given voluntarily. It's clear that some of these women were mentally ill, but a considerable number of these stories were told by healthy women and men without any coercion. What, then, prompted these people to tell such tales? The fact is that the overwhelming majority of these narrators were absolutely convinced that they were describing real events that had happened to them. What's the explanation for this? Researchers have noticed that these stories are very similar to the accounts of people who have used drugs, particularly a substance called LSD. This substance was synthesized in 1938 and became known as a drug in the 1960s. So, how did drugs synthesized in the 20th century appear in the Middle Ages? The thing is, this drug is based on lysergic acid, which is found in the so-called ergot. Ergot is a type of fungus that parasitizes rye. Grains infected by this fungus take on the shape of curved, horn-like structures ranging in color from light brown to violet brown. People who regularly consume black rye bread are at risk of developing an illness due to poisoning by this fungus. Since in the Middle Ages, the majority of peasants primarily subsisted on rye bread, it is unsurprising that descriptions of this disease frequently appear in medieval chronicles. The modern name for this disease is ergotism, derived from one of the alkaloids found in ergot, ergotanine. There are two forms of this disease, convulsive and gangrenous. The first form, convulsive ergotism, is characterized by spasms in various muscle groups. It begins with numbness and tingling in the fingertips, nausea and vomiting, progressing to intense skeletal muscle spasms, often accompanied by varying degrees of paralysis and loss of sensation. In the Middle Ages, this was referred to as witches' convulsions. The second form, gangrenous ergotism, is marked by muscle contractions and tissue necrosis. Patients would begin to experience sensations of crawling insects, nausea, and headaches, followed by sharp, burning pains perceived as an internal fire, leading to the necrosis of limbs. Gangrene most often affected the lower rather than the upper limbs, spreading from the bottom upwards. Additionally, the progression of the disease in its gangrenous form caused intense hallucinations. These hallucinations could even affect outwardly healthy individuals, as the hallucinogenic effects of ergot can occur with even minimal doses. People saw hordes of demons tormenting them, witches, devils, and various catastrophes. These visions were so vivid that during the witch hunts many people falsely confessed, convinced that they had indeed communicated with evil spirits. This is the source of the numerous witch confessions I mentioned at the beginning of the video. Due to these hallucinations, the disease was named St. Anthony's Fire, after the 3 RD 4th century saint whose life was filled with descriptions of his temptations by demons. Here is an excerpt from the life of St. Anthony. One day, the demon knocked on the monastery gates. When I went out, I saw before me a giant whose head seemed to reach the sky. But I spat in his mouth, pronounced the name of Christ, and rushed at him, raising my hand to strike. And as it seemed, I did strike. And at the name of Christ, the giant instantly disappeared with all his demons. The first documented mention of this disease dates back to 857, and subsequent epidemics occurred with alarming regularity. In the 994 epidemic in France, more than 40,000 people perished. In the 11th century, major epidemics occurred in 1043 and 1094. Chroniclers note that in Regensburg alone, over 8,000 residents died within 12 weeks, and small villages were almost entirely wiped out. That year, the epidemic spread across Germany, the Netherlands, France, Burgundy, and Italy. In the following century, major epidemics were recorded in 1109 and 1128, with the latter claiming 14,000 lives in Paris alone. Outbreaks of the disease occurred regularly, with the last recorded case in the early 1950s. When I use the term epidemic in this context, it does not imply that the disease was contagious and spread from person to person. The disease was not infectious. Instead, certain years, due to specific environmental conditions, such as low temperatures, excessively high, or abnormally low humidity, experienced severe contamination of crops with ergot, leading to another outbreak of the disease. In the Middle Ages, efforts were made to treat this disease, and in many cases, the treatment was successful. Naturally, the treatment of St. Anthony's Fire was carried out in the name of the saint. How exactly? In 1089, a wealthy French nobleman named Gaston de Valois, who had prayed for his son's healing before the image of St. Anthony, founded a monastic charitable community to cure those afflicted with St. Anthony's Fire. In 1095, at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II approved the order's charter, known as the Hospitaller Brotherhood of St. Anthony, and, in St. Anthony's name, over 370 hospitals were built for the sick. The patients were placed in a monastery, where they were encouraged to pray to St. Anthony, and they were brought into contact with the saint's relics. Generally, patients recovered, provided the disease had not progressed too far. The main secret of successful treatment was that the patients were fed wheat bread instead of rye bread, as wheat was not contaminated with ergot. Thus, those who took refuge behind the protective walls of the monastic hospital stopped receiving daily doses of poison. However, if a recovered person returned to their usual diet, the disease could reappear. Researchers note a correlation between the mass witch hunts and ergotism. Around 1500, the so-called Little Ice Age began, characterized by colder winters followed by damp springs. This combination was highly conducive to the infection of rye with ergot. The mass witch trials started in 1585 and continued, albeit with interruptions, until the last third of the 17th century. Subsequently, potatoes became the staple food of the poor, and there was a slight increase in the consumption of white wheat bread at the expense of rye bread. Additionally, historians unanimously point out that the witch trials were most widespread in Germany, Switzerland, and France, while they hardly affected Italy and Spain, where the climate was less damp and less favorable for the growth of ergot. Isolated outbreaks of the disease were observed at the end of the 17th to the 20th centuries. However, their intensity was much lower than during the medieval and early modern periods. The last known mass outbreak of ergotism occurred in 1951 in the small town of Pont-Saint-Esprit in France. In one of the local bakeries, bread was made from flour contaminated with ergot, and over 300 people purchased and consumed this bread. Many of them experienced hallucinations, with people believing they were being attacked by terrifying monsters and that fiery balls were raining down from the sky. The residents tore off their clothes and ran naked through the streets. One former pilot, standing on the windowsill of an open window on the 5th floor, loudly shouted, "I am an airplane." He then jumped down onto the grass, breaking his legs, but continued running without feeling the pain. Eventually, the village was surrounded by gendarmes. The most agitated were restrained with straitjackets, and treatment was organized. Unfortunately, 4 people could not be saved. The initial theory was mercury poisoning, but after laboratory tests revealed the presence of ergot alkaloids in the bread, the diagnosis was confirmed as ergotism. And so the tale of the strange behavior of the defendants in the Inquisition trial comes to an end. Goodbye.